Mrs. Evelyn Johnson stood frozen at her son's funeral as Officer Richard Barrett, a local police lieutenant, ripped the American flag from Staff Sergeant James Johnson's casket. What began as a hero's burial had become a national crisis within minutes, broadcast live to over 1 million viewers. The president's name flashed on Barrett's phone, a sign of the high-stakes confrontation that had been building since James's body returned home to Mapleton, Georgia. James Johnson, a 34-year-old Medal of Honor recipient, had sacrificed his life in Afghanistan to save his entire unit. His heroism resonated deeply in his small, divided hometown, where the railroad tracks still unofficially separated white and black neighborhoods. James had risen from poverty and persistent racism to become a symbol of service, following in the footsteps of his father, who had died in the First Gulf War. His mother, Evelyn, a respected nurse administrator, had raised James and his two siblings alone. James was planning to retire soon to care for his mother, whose health was declining. His final act of heroism, positioning himself between his unit and incoming fire, saved 12 lives at the cost of his own. The military awarded James the Medal of Honor posthumously, and his body was returned to American soil with full military honors. Along the journey, Americans lined highways to salute the procession. Back in Mapleton, the community rallied around Evelyn with flowers, handwritten notes, and a prayer vigil growing outside their home. But not everyone viewed James's sacrifice the same way. Lieutenant Richard Barrett, a 46-year-old white police officer with a history of racial profiling, watched the news coverage with visible disgust. He had been rejected from military service in his youth and harbored a deep-seated resentment toward what he called media circuses surrounding military heroes, particularly black ones. Barrett, protected by a department that dismissed complaints against him, saw the funeral as an opportunity to assert his authority. Despite other officers being assigned to the funeral detail, Barrett insisted he would be handling security. "These military boys need to understand who's really in charge here," he muttered to his colleagues. James's sister Mia, a civil rights attorney, flew home from Atlanta to support her mother. Mia had her own history with Barrett, who had harassed her brother years earlier, leaving him with bruises and a quiet determination to leave Mapleton. As news vans descended on their street, Mia noticed Barrett's cruiser parked at the corner, watching their every move. The town's racial tensions, usually hidden beneath a veneer of Southern politeness, were becoming dangerously visible. The night before the service, Barrett began his manipulations. He rerouted the funeral procession with fake road closure signs, reassigned the officers meant to assist with the funeral, and even tried to demand changes to the burial arrangements. As the military chaplain sat with Evelyn and Mia, sharing stories of James's compassion, Barrett observed from his cruiser, researching obscure segregation-era ordinances to justify his actions. He was preparing to turn a solemn ceremony into a battleground for his own prejudice and authority, unaware that the livestream would soon capture his every move for a global audience. The stage was set for a confrontation that would not only disrupt a hero's funeral, but force a reckoning with the racism that had never truly left Mapleton. Barrett, seemingly energized by the growing attention, refused to back down, surrounding himself and the casket with the officers he'd caught for backup. The military officials receiving messages from the Pentagon were told to stand by for direct intervention. The Secretary of Defense had spoken directly with the Georgia governor, who was now mobilizing state police to the scene. As Barrett pulled out a laminated card to read the riot act, threatening to arrest everyone within 3 minutes, Mapleton's mayor, Albert Daniels, breathlessly arrived. He demanded that Barrett stand down, but the lieutenant continued his brazen fabrication, claiming the situation was a national security matter that superseded civilian authority. The mayor stared in disbelief as Barrett invented jurisdictional rules on the spot. At that moment, Barrett's phone rang. He was annoyed, but something about the Washington, D.C. area code made him answer. Lieutenant Barrett, this is the President of the United States. The cemetery fell into an eerie silence as Barrett's face transformed from disbelief to a cold realization. The president provided specific details of his meeting with James Johnson 3 years earlier, as well as an accurate, real-time description of Barrett's uniform and actions. Barrett stammered, his previously commanding voice now uncertain. The president's tone became firm. What you are doing is not only morally reprehensible but legally indefensible. I've just signed an executive order clarifying federal jurisdiction over this specific funeral. Barrett's fellow officers, hearing the one-sided conversation, began to subtly step away from him. The president continued. The Justice Department's Civil Rights Division has already begun reviewing footage of today's events alongside your personnel records. I expect you to stand down immediately. I then want you to apologize to Mrs. Johnson and her family and allow the Military Honor Guard to complete their sacred duty. Barrett, his hand visibly trembling, walked to Evelyn Johnson and extended the phone. The president would like to speak with you, ma'am. Evelyn, with the poise that belied her recent ordeal, took the phone. She spoke with the president for several minutes, her composure finally breaking as tears streamed down her face. The president then asked to be put on speaker. Mrs. Johnson, I want you and everyone present to know that your son's sacrifice will be honored today without further interference. Lieutenant Barrett no longer has any authority at this scene. As Barrett tried to protest, the state police captain, an African-American woman, arrived and announced, Lieutenant Barrett, by order of the governor, you are relieved of duty effective immediately. Surrender your weapon and badge. His authority had completely evaporated. Faced with the complete collapse of his authority, Lieutenant Barrett's hand moved toward his service weapon rather than his badge. The state police officer surrounding him reacted instantly, subduing him professionally but firmly, removing his sidearm and applying handcuffs. As he was escorted to a state police vehicle, Barrett's cries of, "This is a military takeover" and "presidential overreach" fell on unsympathetic ears. His career effectively ended with each step away from the gravesite. On the phone, which was still being held by Evelyn Johnson, the president could be heard giving instructions. Mrs. Johnson, I'm going to stay on this line and listen to your son's ceremony if that's acceptable to you. I want to bear witness to his honors. Evelyn, her tears of grief and relief streaming down her face, nodded. Thank you, Mr. President. James would be honored. With Barrett removed from the scene, the funeral quickly reorganized. The Military Honor Guard resumed their positions with perfect precision, their dignified movements somehow erasing the chaos that had preceded them. State police officers formed a respectful perimeter, ensuring no further disruptions would occur. From the back of the state police cruiser, Barrett watched the ceremony he had so desperately tried to control proceed without him. His expression shifted between anger, disbelief, and the first hints of fear about what would come next. At the Mapleton Police Department, investigators had already begun pulling Barrett's personnel file. They discovered a disturbing pattern that should have raised red flags years earlier. 37 complaints of excessive force or misconduct, 29 of which were from Black residents, all dismissed with minimal investigation. His failed military application had been rejected after psychological screening flagged concerning attitudes about authority and race. Further investigation into his desk and computer revealed his browser history was filled with research into challenging federal authority, and a file labeled Johnson Operation contained printouts of long-repealed segregation-era ordinances. The most damning evidence was a group text to fellow officers where he expressed his intention to put these military boys and that grieving mother in their place. The police chief, horrified by the findings, immediately began damage control efforts that would prove futile in the national spotlight. As the ceremony concluded, Evelyn Johnson received the folded American flag from Captain Mendez, who knelt before her and delivered the traditional words of honor and gratitude from a grateful nation. Evelyn clutched the flag to her chest, her expression a mixture of pride, grief, and the lingering shock of the day. Barrett was transported to a county detention center where his police union representative met him but offered a bleak assessment. This is beyond anything the union can shield you from. The footage is everywhere. No court in the country is going to see what you did as legitimate police work. The morning after Staff Sergeant James Johnson's funeral, Mapleton awoke to find itself at the center of a national conversation about racism in American policing. Major news networks sent additional reporters to the small town, and the Mapleton Police Department, under intense public and legal pressure, was forced to release Barrett's whole service history. The documents revealed a pattern of systemic neglect, showing that multiple supervisors had endorsed his aggressive policing tactics in black neighborhoods and dismissed the numerous complaints against him. His failed military application had been rejected after psychological screening flagged concerning attitudes about authority and race. Further investigation into his desk and computer revealed his browser history was filled with research into challenging federal authority, and a file labeled Johnson Operation contained printouts of long-repealed segregation-era ordinances. The most damning evidence was a group text to fellow officers where he expressed his intention to put these military boys and that grieving mother in their place. The police chief, horrified by the findings, immediately began damage control efforts that would prove futile in the national spotlight. Evelyn Johnson emerged as an unexpected voice of moral clarity in the national conversation. In one television interview, she explained, "My son believed in an America worth fighting for. What happened at his funeral exposed how far we still have to go to fulfill that promise." When asked about her anger toward Barrett, she responded, "Anger doesn't serve my son's memory. What serves him is working toward the America he believed in." Her words resonated across the country, earning her widespread respect. Maya Johnson, now working with national civil rights attorneys, filed a comprehensive lawsuit against the Mapleton Police Department. "This isn't just about one bad officer," she explained at a press conference. "This is about a system that enabled and protected him." The Department of Justice announced a formal civil rights investigation into the Mapleton Police Department, and the Pentagon established a review committee to create new protocols to prevent similar incidents from happening again. This would eventually lead to the Sergeant Johnson Protection Act, which established clear federal jurisdiction over military funerals. Barrett's support continued to erode as more evidence, including racially charged text messages, came to light. His own police union formally voted to deny him legal representation, citing that his conduct was so far outside the boundaries of legitimate policing that it was a personal, not a professional action. 1 year after the funeral that became a national inflection point, Lieutenant Richard Barrett stood before a judge for sentencing, having been convicted on multiple charges, including civil rights violations and abuse of authority. The courtroom was packed. Evelyn Johnson sat in the front row, her posture as dignified as ever. The judge, a Vietnam veteran himself, delivered a powerful statement. "Mr. Barrett, your actions were not merely an affront to a grieving family. They represented a fundamental betrayal of the principles that Staff Sergeant Johnson died defending." Barrett was sentenced to 5 years in federal prison and permanently barred from holding any position in law enforcement. He showed no visible reaction, still clinging to his self-justification. As Barrett began serving his sentence, the Mapleton Police Department underwent a complete restructuring under federal oversight. The chief and 3 senior officers who had protected him were forced to resign. New hiring practices, training protocols, and accountability measures were implemented with significant input from community members, including Evelyn. The Sergeant James Johnson Foundation for Racial Healing was established by Evelyn, using settlement funds from her successful lawsuit against the department. The foundation focused on creating dialogue between law enforcement and communities of color, sponsoring scholarships for minority students in public service, and hosting training workshops for police departments nationwide. The memorial ceremony marking the 1-year anniversary of James's death became a powerful symbol of the changes taking place. The president, fulfilling a promise he made during that fateful phone call, traveled to Mapleton to deliver the keynote address personally. He stated that James's sacrifice and his family's courage had helped the nation confront difficult truths about the work that still needed to be done. Maya Johnson's legal career flourished as she successfully argued a landmark case based on the incident, earning her national recognition and an eventual appointment as a civil rights advisor to the Department of Justice. Barrett's journey through the legal system continued, with multiple denied appeals. Isolated in prison, he was required to watch documentary footage of historical civil rights abuses, including his own actions at the Johnson funeral. For the first time, he saw himself as others saw him, and a slow, reluctant reckoning with his past began. The community of Mapleton also underwent a transformation, with the Reconciliation Commission documenting historical injustices and the town becoming known for its commitment to confronting its past honestly. 3 years after the funeral incident, the most unexpected development occurred when Evelyn Johnson requested permission to visit Richard Barrett in prison. The meeting, which took place in a private room, was not made public, but witnesses reported that Barrett broke down in tears midway through their conversation. With Evelyn's permission, Barrett later released a statement acknowledging for the first time the full impact of his actions and expressing genuine remorse. Mrs. Johnson showed me a kind of grace I never deserved. She helped me see the real human cost of the prejudice I had carried. Nothing can undo the pain I caused her family, but I am committed to spending whatever years I have left trying to understand and atone for my actions. This statement marked Barrett's beginning of participation in restorative justice programs, where he eventually began speaking to police cadets about the dangers of unchecked authority and implicit bias. On the 5th anniversary of James's funeral, a permanent memorial was dedicated in Mapleton's town center on the very spot where segregated water fountains had once stood. The bronze statue depicted Staff Sergeant Johnson in uniform, with inscriptions honoring both his military heroism and the civil rights legacy his death had spawned. Evelyn, now recognized with multiple humanitarian awards, stood surrounded by a community transformed by painful truth and determined reconciliation. Military and police leaders stood side by side, a visual representation of the institutional changes that had occurred in the years following the confrontation. The Police Academy Training Center in Atlanta had even been renamed the Johnson Center for Ethical Policing. As Evelyn placed her hand on the memorial statue of her son, the cameras captured her whispering a thank you. Whether she was thanking her son for his sacrifice, the community for its transformation, or perhaps even expressing gratitude for the painful journey that had created meaningful change, only she knew for certain. What was clear to everyone present was that Staff Sergeant James Johnson's legacy had expanded far beyond his heroism on the battlefield, to include a transformation in his hometown and ripples of change across the nation's approach to both military honors and police accountability. This story reminds us that dignity isn't a privilege, it's a right that transcends race and circumstance. When prejudice infiltrates institutions meant to protect us, the damage tears at our social fabric. Barrett's actions weren't isolated, but enabled by decades of overlooked complaint and normalized discrimination. The president's intervention demonstrated that moral leadership matters, and Evelyn's journey showed that true transformation requires both accountability and reconciliation. The painful confrontation in Mapleton, while difficult, ultimately led to genuine healing and progress, proving that no community is beyond redemption when people commit to facing hard truths honestly and working together towards a more just future.